Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're putting on our forensic gloves. This isn't going to be a celebratory conversation about the colossal might of the Jägers or, the glory of their famous victories. We are conducting a cold, dark autopsy on the machine's very heart, the energy core.
That's exactly right. For this deep dive, we are trading the roar of plasma cannons for the grim, hard reality hidden within the engineering blueprints. When we started examining these sources, we were actually trying to find a straightforward technical ranking of efficiency. What we found instead was a map of tragedy, a detailed timeline tracing human, moral, and ethical decline hidden inside the colossal machines designed, supposedly, to save us.
Okay, let's unpack this chilling observation right out of the gate, because the evidence in the source material is, well, it's deeply disturbing. We are starting this analysis with the shocking reality that some Jägers literally cooked their own pilots from the inside. Other Jägers, the ones representing the apex of power, were built with technology so sensitive and so compromising that their detailed plans were just erased completely by governmental decree. And this was to prevent not just the enemy, but even allies from knowing their true source of power. I mean, the depth of the secrecy here, it really speaks volumes.
It speaks to the core truth of the entire conflict. That desperation always supersedes morality in a zero-sum war. The foundational decision was always cost over consequence. Reactors were designed, constructed, and installed in mere days, without sufficient consideration for the long-term biological effects on the pilots. The primary overriding objective, as you can see in the early defense memos, was prioritizing the containment of a kaiju threat, specifically keeping them miles away from financial centers and global trade routes, over the longevity or even the short-term health of the contained pilots who were operating the machines.
So the mission of this deep dive, then, is not about celebrating technological breakthroughs. It's about meticulously tracing the escalation from desperate, corner-cutting solutions to irreversible, self-betraying errors. The data reveals a terrifying, consistent variable throughout the war. The most powerful cores were invariably the most dangerous to humanity itself, not just to the kaiju. We are charting a course of escalating lethal technology, lethal to the operator, first and foremost.
Precisely. We are viewing this list of 10 Jäger cores not as a countdown of mechanical success, but as a countdown of ethical failure, a slow, steady descent into technical madness. So let's begin our grim descent into the age of disposable pilots, starting at rank 10, which, in the context of human consideration, is arguably the pinnacle of absolute desperation.
At rank 10, we encounter the very first generation of Jägers. Reading the technical reports on these Mark I and early Mark II models, it becomes so clear they were truly doomed from the start.
They were. These machines were not birthed from refined technological miracles. They were conceived in total panic. We're talking about utilizing primary atomic nuclei, specifically large, cumbersome, early-stage fission reactors. They were brute force solutions, huge, unstable, and highly toxic. They served as a massive containment shell for what was essentially a radioactive generator, implemented purely as a stopgap measure to counter that immediate kaiju wave.
And the cost of that urgency is laid bare in the financial records. The sources are absolutely clear on this. While cities were literally collapsing and global trade routes were grinding to a halt, the immediate imperative was military response married to economic preservation. The political pressure just dictated speed, and this meant prioritizing the delivery of raw, localized power to move the machine. While the cost of safety measures, the thick, heavy shielding required to protect the cockpit, were the first things cut from the budget.
And that budget cut translated directly into a horrifying human toll. The internal temperatures and the immediate radiation signature of these early reactors were so severe the pilots were poisoned from the moment the system achieved full power. The source material chillingly notes that pilots rarely lasted more than 3 or 4 missions before collapsing from acute radiation sickness and long-term biological failure. These early cores, using relatively cheap, low-grade enriched uranium, just vented their toxicity straight into the operational system.
So when we look back at Jägers like Brawler Yukon or Romeo Blue or even the early versions of Horizon Brave, and we remember their legendary status, we are looking at fame built on a horrifying foundation. Our sources don't mince words here. Their short-lived, glorious fame is literally built upon the corpses of hundreds of disposable pilots. It was the technological equivalent of using a one-time use biological component.
It establishes the precedent for the entire war effort. The key concepts defining this initial age are desperation, instability, and critically, economy first. They proved that the Jäger concept worked, yes, but they also firmly established that the machine's operational longevity was valued significantly above the operator's life expectancy. This brings us swiftly to rank 9, and the Russian response, Cherno Alpha, which found a way to circumvent the short lifespan limitation, but only by introducing a truly gruesome solution.
Cherno Alpha is often romanticized, isn't it? It's a brute of Soviet steel, pure mass, pure power. It ran a heavily modified, reinforced Mark I reactor, prioritizing brute force and structural integrity. It was designed specifically for raw, sustained, close-quarters combat in hostile, cold environments. While other Jägers would overheat or expose pilots to fatal levels of radiation in minutes, Cherno was built to simply endure. But the essential question remains, given the inherent toxicity of that Mark I reactor, how did the pilots endure?
And this is where the forensic examination uncovers the truly horrifying innovation of the Russian design philosophy. The secret to the pilots' sustained endurance wasn't better internal shielding. There just wasn't enough internal volume for the shielding necessary for a system that powerful. Instead, they developed an experimental, highly invasive, external blood filtering system.
Can you walk us through the mechanics of that? Because our sources describe something almost medieval in its invasiveness.
The process was terrifyingly straightforward. The pilot's blood was actively circulated out of their body through a complex series of heavily shielded external tubes. These tubes were routed across the outer structural shell of the reactor housing itself. The blood was purified in real time, stripping out the accumulating toxins, heavy metals, and immediate radiation damage. And then, after being supercooled and traded, it was returned to the body. This system required immense power to run, drawing directly from the reactor itself, creating a kind of parasitic dependency.
A literal dialysis of war. Wow, that sounds less like piloting a sophisticated weapon and more like being strapped into a mobile industrial-scale life support machine that just happens to be attached to a walking nuclear reactor. The psychological strain alone must have been unbearable.
It was. The forensic analysis reveals that the Russian pilots did last longer, certainly, achieving far more mission hours than their Mark-I counterparts in other nations. However, internal documentation describes them as doped, drained, as if they were literally part of the motor itself. Quote, they gained physical endurance by becoming integrated, sustained mechanical components of the machine, willingly sacrificing their long-term physiological autonomy in exchange for immediate combat effectiveness.
It just changes the entire narrative of Cherno Alpha. It may have been a tank with a soul, but our sources paint the final, dark picture, a monster with a metallic skin and a radioactive heart, barely sustained with tubes and the sheer force of human will. This rank sets a disturbing pattern for the rest of the war. That sustained violence against the kaiju only comes at the cost of profound systemic bodily compromise for the humans fighting in the suit.
The transition to rank 8, featuring Coyote Tango and Tacit Ronin, marks a decisive conceptual shift globally. We move past sheer brute force and enter the age of engineering efficiency. Japan and the U.S. pushed past the heavy, early fission models and began developing smaller, more potent, and far more ambitious new-generation reactors. This was heralded as the moment humanity finally achieved technological mastery over its own power needs.
But, as our sources tragically confirm, this efficiency quickly became a lethal paradox. Coyote Tango, specifically, was an engineering marvel on paper. It boasted a smaller profile, yet it was capable of powering continuous attack systems, like rapid plasma cannon firing without stability loss. It was an energetic beast that promised agility combined with overwhelming firepower.
And that concentrated energy came with a massive immediate cost, far beyond the initial toxicity of the Mark I cores. The compact, high-output reactor in Coyote Tango generated such intense thermal and radioactive leakage that its brilliance was its betrayal. The official records we analyzed confirm Coyote Tango killed 3 pilots outright during its short operational life and left the 4th pilot condemned due to irreversible extreme radiation exposure and neurological damage.
And Tacit Ronin, the highly agile Japanese Jäger, followed that exact same lethal pattern. Agile, fast, and deadly to the enemy, but with an internal core system that our sources describe simply as lethal to the operator. The Jäger shone technologically, but it consumed those who dared to pilot it. The chilling constant that defines this entire generation becomes clear. The more powerful and efficient the nucleus, the more fragile and disposable the human body becomes inside the suit. Can we pause there and try to understand the science? I mean, why did efficiency equal lethality? Shouldn't a better engineered core be safer?
That's the logical assumption. And it's the misconception that drove this entire generation of design. The problem wasn't the engineering itself. It was the physics of miniaturization under pressure. When you compress a high-yield fusion or advanced fission reactor, which is what these Mark III models were, to fit into a smaller chassis for increased speed and agility, the thermal and kinetic demands on the shielding increase exponentially. The engineers tried to use lighter, thinner materials to save weight, but these materials proved wholly inadequate for containing the reactor's immediate power output during peak combat spikes. The result was instantaneous, catastrophic radiation leakage that no standard suit or cockpit design could counteract.
So the technology advanced, but the ethical and physical component regressed completely. Jägers stopped being seen solely as weapons designed for global salvation, and rapidly started being recognized as lethal curses for those who were unfortunate enough to be designated as their pilots. Humanity was gaining power while sacrificing personnel at an accelerating rate.
Exactly. But in the midst of this terrifying efficiency curve, Rank 7 provides a small, deeply fascinating flicker of conscience, Gipsy Danger, and its notable, though ultimately incomplete, attempted redemption.
Gipsy Danger, of course, became the icon of the war, the last great symbol of the Mark III era. But its origin, as you noted, was far darker. It started out exactly like Coyote Tango. Brutal, highly radioactive, and dangerously unstable.
It was on the express path to becoming another deadly casualty statistic. However, its place in this ranking reflects a singular, crucial modification that occurred after its devastating initial combat failure. During its repairs and refitting, its nucleus was completely redimensioned and redesigned. Gipsy maintained its formidable offensive power, but for the first time in Jäger history, it received a far more sophisticated active radiation control system. It was the moment someone in the Pan-Pacific Defense Corps Logistics Command paused and asked the revolutionary question: does the pilot actually have to die every time the mission is complete?
That pause, that momentary political and ethical intervention, represents the peak of human ethical consideration in Jäger design. So what did this system involve? Was it just better armor?
Well, far more sophisticated. The new Gipsy version included a complex, active filtering and full immersion suit that was designed not just for structural protection, but specifically to filter and scrub up to 80% of the accumulated radioactive and thermal damage during combat. This involved continuous circulation of cryogenic fluids and advanced chemical scrubbers built directly into the pilot's life support apparatus. It required immense resources and engineering time.
Which means it was still a partial fix. 80% is not 100%. The pilots were still taking significant chronic damage, but it represented a clear, intentional, and expensive effort at what the sources call an attempted equilibrium between absolute necessary power and the possibility, the hope, of actually returning home alive and healthy.
It was a false hope, ultimately, given the war's trajectory, but it fundamentally broke the cynical mold set by the earlier generations. The key words for this section are false hope, sophisticated control, and incomplete mitigation. The war machine was finally starting to grudgingly acknowledge the human cost, even if only partially, before the reality of bureaucratic efficiency took over completely.
The brief, shining moment of conscience provided by Gipsy Danger, however, was immediately extinguished by the cold political reality of war funding and coordination. Moving to Rank 6, we enter what the sources term the uprising generation, marked by technological homogenization and, well, structural sterility.
The political context here is absolutely crucial to understanding this decline. After the initial wave of kaiju attacks, Jäger production essentially halted. There was a dangerous lapse in political and financial will. When the threat resurfaced in force, the global response was one of coordinated, centralized defense, the War of the Pacific. The World Coalition realized they couldn't afford proprietary, custom-built nuclear monsters anymore.
And this centralization, this demand for rapid, mass-produced deployment, fundamentally altered Jäger technology. The newly produced Jäger Saber Athena, Bracer Phoenix, Guardian Bravo were modern, aesthetically sleek, incredibly fast, and boasted superior maneuverability. But the forensic finding is damning. They all shared identical series-replicated reactors.
The individual engineering genius, the national secret sauce that gave us the terrifyingly unique cores of the Mark I and Mark III models, was gone. It was replaced by shared efficiency and a standardized global supply chain. This is the era of the technical plateau, where stability was prioritized over true evolution.
So the nations prioritized shared resources and predictable outcomes over risk and unique genius. These Jägers were undeniably excellent combat vehicles, stable, predictable, and reliable, but they didn't shine or mark a difference. They were mere soldiers, not legends, built off a successful but fundamentally non-innovative shared chassis design.
It signifies a deep-seated loss of faith in fundamental, paradigm-shifting science. Humanity chose organizational efficiency and the safety of shared resources over the inherent risks of pushing true technological boundaries. They were playing it safe, content with maximizing known output rather than exploring the terrifying unknown.
Which makes the jump to rank 5 Gipsy Avenger all the more fascinating, because Australia clearly refused to accept that plateau. This core is widely regarded in the archives as the true nuclear apex, yet simultaneously it represents the technical exhaustion of purely human scientific thought in a single machine.
That paradox is exactly what we need to highlight. Australia, fiercely independent in its defense strategy, was clearly not willing to share experimental technology, yet they also weren't willing to risk the catastrophic unknown of exotic power sources. They took established known nuclear technology, the Gipsy Danger Mark III model, and pushed its refinement to the absolute physical, chemical, and engineering extreme. They successfully maximized the status quo, refusing the plateau, but achieving no true revolution.
But wasn't the use of 2 cores an innovation? Avenger has 2 fully functional cores, one dedicated entirely to movement and system stability, and a second dedicated exclusively to weaponry, allowing for the near-constant punishing plasma shots that made it so famous.
Duplication is refinement, not evolution, in this context. The core innovation wasn't inventing a new energy source. It was figuring out the immense engineering challenge of synchronizing and distributing power across 2 separate nuclear reactors simultaneously, without incurring catastrophic feedback or thermal overload. They were experts in logistics, managing 2 known energy sources rather than creating one new, exponentially more powerful source. Avenger is, therefore, the pinnacle of controlled human technology. It is the most powerful human-built nuclear Jäger on Earth, representing the absolute maximum control over known energy sources. But that's the key. It signals the limit. They had nowhere left to go with fission technology.
And then, just before the full ethical and biological collapse, we hit rank 4, Crimson Typhoon, China's spectacular yet ultimately tragic foray into reckless ambition.
Typhoon is the great anomaly of the late nuclear war period. China wasn't satisfied with defense, stability, or simple duplication. They explicitly built this Jäger to achieve technical superiority and dominance. They fundamentally broke the rules of classical Jäger design and safe physics, opting for complexity and inherent volatility.
How exactly did they play with fire on an engineering level?
They utilized what the sources call dangerous symmetry. Typhoon employed 2 reactors working in close, synchronized opposition. One was a powerful conventional core handling the main movement and systems requirements. But the second reactor was highly specialized, a smaller, extremely precise reactor located directly in the shoulder assembly, exclusively dedicated to powering the massive, articulated 3-clawed plasma arm. This demanded instantaneous, massive power spikes that the main core simply couldn't handle quickly enough.
And the sources reveal that this plasma arm, which was the entire reason for the dangerous dual reactor system, was never actually seen used in combat scenarios by the pilots.
That is the staggering piece of evidence that invalidates the entire design philosophy. They built an enormously complex, terrifyingly dangerous system around a weapon that was apparently too volatile, too risky, or too unstable to deploy effectively without guaranteeing the destruction of the Jäger itself. The risk assessment here is terrifyingly clear. China sought not just defense, but absolute technical superiority, and they were willing to court internal disaster to secure that fleeting ambition.
It sets the stage perfectly. Crimson Typhoon marks humanity's final, reckless desire for power just before the complete ethical collapse. They tried to change the rules of the war through complexity and ambition, exhausting the purely nuclear path and forcing the ultimate departure from human technology altogether. Now we enter the final 3 ranks of this dark autopsy, where the concept of a human-built core dissolves completely into secrecy and biological betrayal. At rank 3, we have Striker Eureka, the monster built on absolute, uncompromising secrecy.
Eureka is the Jäger that achieved godlike status fast, relentlessly lethal, precise, and notably, the only Jäger to remain invictum in combat, never suffering a catastrophic failure. It was designed to win the war, not merely hold the line, but the sheer impossible scale of its performance demanded a closer forensic look at its source of power.
And the mystery remains total, almost by design. Australia only showed what it wanted the world to see. Its energy core remains an absolute enigma to this day. There are no detailed blueprints available to the wider coalition, no open technical data, only rumors and the undeniable, monstrous results of its performance in the field.
The official version maintained that Striker Eureka represented the ultimate evolution of the Gipsy Avenger-style nuclear reactor, a super-refined, perfected version. But the truth, supported by the extreme secrecy and the sheer capability gap between it and Avenger, strongly suggests the incorporation of non-human technology into its core design. We are talking about rumors of precursor materials used in shielding, or perhaps exotic non-fission-based propulsion systems that allowed for its impossible acceleration and sustained high-G maneuvers.
So the secrecy surrounding Stryker's exact reactor type isn't just about protecting a national advantage, is it? It implies that Australia never intended to share its most powerful secrets, even with allies struggling in the same war. This suggests profound technological paranoia within the human coalition itself. The internal seeds of betrayal were already firmly planted long before the enemy needed to step in.
That fractured trust is exactly what Rank 2 exploits and capitalizes on. The drones and the sheer calculated scale of the biological betrayal that followed.
What Xiao Industries, the engineers of the drone fleet, presented was innovation, a sleek, automated defense force. But internally, our sources reveal a core running on something far more dangerous than refined uranium.
What they did was not engineering innovation, it was a mask for scientific treason. The drones were technologically brilliant on the surface, yes, but internally they were powered by pure, dangerous biotechnology. China shifted the goal entirely away from nuclear or energy efficiency and moved directly toward biotechnological obedience. They sought to circumvent the fundamental human limitation of the drift.
And the architect of this shift was critical, Newton Geisler, a kaiju biologist, an expert on the enemy's mind and body, not a traditional hardware engineer. They hired the expert on the enemy to build their defense system.
This is the moment of irreversible contamination in the war's narrative. Newton was tasked not with creating a better reactor, but with creating a revolutionary cerebral interface that eliminated the traditional, cumbersome, and failure-prone human drift requirement. The logic was, one drone, one pilot, one mind, and the machine handles the complex neural synchronization instantly.
But the rest was the unholy engine, the core. This is the crucial, devastating detail that our sources are so clear on. Each Jäger drone carried a living fragment, a kaiju brain, or a section of its cerebral tissue, housed deep inside the core structure, often disguised as a complex support system.
This kaiju fragment was not just a computer chip. It was the organic motor that made them so fast, so lethal, and so instantly responsive. The biotechnological obedience was achieved because the kaiju tissue, being instantly compatible with precursor systems, provided an alien neural processor that bypassed the need for two human minds to synchronize. They achieved perfect, immediate control by outsourcing consciousness to the enemy's biology.
It was an act of profound biotraitorous lunacy. The drones were no longer simply machines or human systems. They became hybrid creatures with their own consciousness, a consciousness derived from the enemy, and an uncontrollable alien-directed force. This was human technology powered by alien intelligence, an alliance that never should have existed, and which, predictably, led directly to disaster.
The cores of these drones were not merely improved versions. They were a total fusion of kaiju biology and unknown energy comprehension systems. Organic reactors that didn't need recharging or human synchronization. It proved that when you invite the enemy's mind into your weapon, you don't just lose control of the outcome, you actively hand over the mechanism of war.
Which brings us to the terrifying Rank 1, Obsidian Fury, the funeral for human logic, and the physical manifestation of all previous mistakes.
Obsidian Fury is the logical, horrifying culmination of scientific treason, the point where human engineering ceases to matter entirely. It is not a Jäger, nor is it strictly a kaiju, but an artificial monster born from years of deep, secret experiments financed by treacherous interests and built using entirely stolen alien technology. It is the final result of pushing technological boundaries past the point of not just ethics, but sanity itself.
Its core is scientifically impossible by all human standards. What did the investigation uncover about its true nature?
Its energy center is not a reactor in the human sense of generating or containing energy. It's a living organ, a biotech core developed using direct precursor blueprints. And most shockingly, its entire sustained power was fueled by pure kaiju blood. The precursors had clearly mastered a form of biological energy harvesting that renders all of humanity's nuclear struggles moot.
Describe the sheer absurd power generated. How does it defy all prior human physics?
The kaiju blood functioned not as a fuel to be burned, but as a catalyst to be multiplied. A single contained drop of kaiju blood was enough to keep Obsidian Fury active at maximum, punishing power, for over a month. The core didn't just generate energy, it multiplied it, creating a perpetual motion machine that was autosufficient, unstoppable, and truly lethal. It operated at energy levels that should have disintegrated any conventional human chassis.
To put that into terrifying numerical perspective, because the numbers themselves become incomprehensible, the sources estimate that to match the total sustained energy output of Obsidian Fury, humanity would have needed the combined power of all Jägers ever built across all Mark generations, and then multiply that collective power by 10 or 20 times. The figures move from engineering reality into science fiction, operating entirely outside this universe of human capability.
Obsidian Fury represents the definitive, tragic end of human logic applied to war. The human defense effort ultimately reached its pinnacle by discarding everything that was human, adopting the enemy's science entirely, and using their own lifeblood as the ultimate fuel source. It is a victory for the precursors, achieved through human hands long before they successfully initiated their final invasion.
So if we synthesize this entire grim timeline, what we are left with is a clear escalation from a primal, panicked need for solutions to the ultimate irreversible error of selling our souls for power. Every technological advance we discussed, every jump in ranking reflected a political failure, an economic pressure, or eventually a dangerous ambition that prioritized a specific short-term victory over long-term structural principle.
The list of human losses in this tragic pursuit of power is agonizingly clear. Humanity lost, in order, the health of its pilots, followed by its foundational ethics, then its control over its own technology, and finally, completely, its identity as a species fighting an independent war. The machine became the master, and the pilot became the slave, or, in the final ranks, simply the biological component necessary to run alien hardware.
The acknowledged fundamental tragedy is that while we thought we were building better, stronger weapons, we were secretly handing the soul of the war to the enemy. The most powerful cores, those that ultimately defined the desperate final battles, were not human creations at all. They were biological, they were alive, and they were alien to everything we once understood as technology.
The true horror is not that we fought a losing war, but that we lost the war internally first. We became so consumed by the need for ultimate power that we willingly adopted the mechanisms of the enemy. The truly terrifying realization is not that we lost control, but that in seeking to defeat the enemy by using their own power, humanity slowly converted itself into the very precursors it fought, sacrificing its unique identity for the illusion of technological supremacy.
What does it mean when the absolute pinnacle of your defense technology is a biological organ powered by the blood of your foe? That is the grim, silent reality of the Jäger core catastrophe. We will see you on the next deep dive.